Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, esteemed colleagues, dear students and friends. Welcome to the second day of our conference, Anglicists and Americanists Today, celebrating 100 years of English and American studies in Iași. Introducing a keynote speaker is like being the opening act at a rock concert. No one came to see me, but I get to warm the stage a bit and feel important for about 30 seconds. It's my great honor to introduce today's keynote speaker, Professor Wolfgang Hochbruck, a distinguished scholar in North American studies at the University of Freiburg, Germany. The University of Freiburg has played an important role in supporting our own university, especially the English department, through joint research initiatives, academic exchange programs, and by offering valuable institutional models for international collaboration and academic development. For many of us, the initial step upon arriving in Freiburg was to visit Professor Hochbruck's office. I hope he still has the replica of the iconic sign from Checkpoint Charlie, reading "You're now leaving the American sector" on the inside of his office door. Now, I could stand here and list all his accomplishments, but let's be honest, we'd be here quite a while, and none of us signed up for a biography reading session. So instead, let me just say this. Professor Hochbruck's academic journey began at the University of Freiburg, where he earned his MA in 1986. He also studied in Halifax and Berkeley. He later completed his habilitation at the University of Stuttgart. Since 2003, he has been professor of North American philology and cultural studies at the University of Freiburg, with research interests ranging from American literature and theater to cultural studies. He has published five books and more than 100 journal articles. His contributions to these fields are both wide-ranging and insightful, including work on Native American traditions, Canadian short fiction, the American Civil War, and yes, you heard it, firefighters. But beyond his scholarly achievements, Professor Hochbruck is a passionate educator. He currently serves as the head of the Department of English at the University of Freiburg and vice director of the Center for Security and Society. In recent years, his academic and personal interests have increasingly turned towards disaster response. In fact, he is an active firefighter, serving as an engine lieutenant and fire safety training officer. I hope I got this right. So his work bridges history with public service, making complex subjects accessible and relevant to the contemporary society. Let me also add that he's a dear friend of our university, having taught here on more than one occasion. So we're especially thrilled to welcome him back. We're truly fortunate to have Professor Hochbruck with us today. Please join me in giving him a warm welcome to the stage.
Well, that was very generous. Thank you, Dragoș. And it's good to be back. It's my third time in Iași, and I'm glad I made it. It was a bit difficult, but I'll leave that part out. So yeah, thank you all for having me here. In order not to disappoint anybody, I'll start with an apology. This paper will be more of a rant than a scholarly discourse. And I know that this is supposed to be a keynote address at a conference, one of the choicest moments in a scholar's life. And I'm sincerely grateful to my colleague and friend Dragoș for inviting me here and honoring me with this position. So don't blame him for me not conforming with the standards. I won't grasp the chance to advance some theory or to talk about an author that the majority of colleagues agrees on is currently still considered great, nor will I try to resurrect some of the greats of yesteryear. I've seen authors and theories come and go, and now that I'm obviously descending the slope to becoming a dead white male myself, I find I'm less and less inclined to participate in the set of games that comes with the profession. For instance, when I was a young assistant professor, everybody had to mention in any of the papers Michael Bachtin, which was okay with me. Then that switched to Homer Baba and to Gayatri Spivak and other people with impronounceable names. And by 2016, which must have been, I think that was the last time I participated in the annual conference of German American Studies scholars in Osnabrück, it was Giorgio Agamben. And I remember there a moderately interesting and slightly humorous keynote, which was okay, followed by 3 nail-bitingly self-conscious younger scholars who all gave papers with titles like Queering the Post-Colonial Subjects in Hepzibah Plonk's The Pipsqueak Papers or something like that. And at that time, the occupation of the Crimea and the war in eastern Ukraine had already been taking place for 2 years. German cars and houses were unwaveringly guzzling cheap Russian gas and petrol. And Gazprom had a former German chancellor on its payroll. I mean, is there something like a bribe roll? Is that an English word? And German and other European companies and shareholders were still reaping generous profits out of business connections with an authoritarian state, the president of which had declared in so many words at the security conference in Munich that he was going to resurrect the Soviet Empire. This academic situation largely persists to this day. The political situation, however, has become considerably more dangerous. The authoritarian president is still in office. He extended the 2014 conflict into a full-scale attack on the neighboring country. His forces are supposed to increase to 1.8 million soldiers next fall, and for all we know, his plans haven't changed. He is matched on what used to be the free world side by a deranged clown who seems intent to single-handedly destroy economic as well as military alliances and decades and even centuries of social and constitutional democracy. So, and we are still having papers and conferences like, well, anyway, one of the most frequently used metaphors for recent developments is that they provided wake-up calls, but somehow for every wake-up call there seems to be somebody who hits the snooze button afterwards, and it's a situation that makes Christopher Clark's sleepwalkers, that is the people and lawmakers before the First World War, look wide awake. Is there a semantic top-off to sleepwalking? Can we have the sleepwalkingest government since World War I? I like to make up English words as I go along, as you may notice. I wonder if there will be a Christopher Clark somewhere in the dystopian future that I'm currently hypothesizing, and I wonder where that future Christopher Clark will draw the timeline from when that war commenced. Because this is where we are, at the beginning or possibly already in the middle of a war. This is where I got the metonymy for my title today, to go back to an even older metaphor for the 1914 situation. It was British Foreign Secretary, wrong direction, Sir Edward Grey, who told a friend that the lamps were going out all over Europe and we shall not see them again lit in our lifetime. Seems to be quite adequate insofar as the Russians and the Ukrainians are primarily targeting each other's energy infrastructure And that's also where part of the hybrid war is being taken in Western Europe, for all I can tell, also from the position of a firefighter, energy production and transportation. So what can we do in this situation? What I will try to do in the next 40 or so minutes is an assessment of our role as scholars in English and American studies within the framework of this hybrid war. And I suggest to do that in 7 sections. Here they are. So at the end of it all, there will be a glimpse of light at the end of the tunnel, I promise that. Hybrid wars. Let's have a poll here quickly. Who agrees with me that we are already on the borderline of a military conflict? 1, 2, 3, 4. The younger ones not so. Okay, I hope you're right, because I would say the hybrid warfare is visible on a variety of fronts. Political situation almost as dangerous, if not more so, than during the so-called Cold War. Constant heckling and interference, notably at sea. I was a conscript soldier in the Navy in the late 70s, and some of the cowboy and Indian games we experienced there, I experienced there, still wake me up at night 45 years later. I'm told that it's actually worse these days. So be it severed communication cables, be it drones that nobody knows where they come from, be it explosive devices placed in critical infrastructure, it's all there. There are minor things too, like stuffed exhaust pipes of cars with construction foam in them, and then stickers left on site that seem to be coming from the environmentalist party in Germany. The kind of disinformation war. Disinformation actually being a loan word in English from Russian. Yeah, great. To the point where confusion reigns and people retreat to what they want to believe rather than what is actually happening in real time and space. I don't have to tell you what kind of power the systematic and multi-pronged use of disinformation, malinformation, rumors, and conspiracy theories can wield. The interference with the elections in Romania particularly showed quite clearly what the other side is actually capable of. And then there are the direct cyber attacks. This is a kind of covered, more or less still covered warfare, but that's been happening for years. Any European university computer lab that I've talked to about this in the last few years has told me that they're spending considerable time and amount of personal resources and funding in this defense against the dark arts, so to speak. The purpose of many of these attacks is that the groups behind them either try to gain economic advantage out of it or important information, including military intelligence. So this may not be quite a war yet, but it's definitely not peace any longer. And involvement of our profession so far, practically zilch. Even classes about war literature and war films usually end with Vietnam or the latest with Iraq, but contemporary issues, no. Number 2, climate conflict. Started out as dystopian and speculative fictions, which are now being gobbled up by actual developments that amount to warfare against the very base of our natural lives. I read the term petromasculinist recently for this kind of warfare, and though I'm not usually happy with genderized ascriptions, in this case I concur. It is mostly a male phenomenon. The climate catastrophe has gathered speed in recent years. March of this year was more than 2 centigrades warmer in Europe than the median average from 1990 to 2021, and that's just the last 30 years anyway. So, and the fact that vast amounts of money that would have been very welcome to combat this situation and these developments is going into warfare and defense doesn't make things better. So, what about eco-criticism? We have eco-criticism at our disposal. Great. As a reaction to the developing crisis, the invention of eco-criticism was one of those typical responses by the academia. If a new topicality gathers enough support and weight to achieve critical mass, universities will react with the institutionalization of a new course of studies or even a new department. Well, the problem then becomes circular. Research in the field becomes an end in itself if there's no transmission of insights into not just the academic community but the wider public, with effects on the economic system and the environment. Not a single tree is saved by our counting the trees in James Fenimore Cooper's Deerslayer novels. Unfortunately, there are few projects where eco-criticism is part of a visible impact on environmental conditions, and most of those projects are of an interdisciplinary nature. Secondly, one of the more detrimental developments in environmental studies is our contribution to strategies of semantic appeasement and euphemisms. Global warming sounds nice and comfortable, doesn't it? Climate change even has a positive twang to it. Change through commerce, Wandel durch Handel, one of those slogans by which the former German chancellor I mentioned earlier sold his profitable Russia connections to the public. The current US administration is not only intent on banning diversity, equity, and integration from the programs of universities nationwide, but also climate research and teaching. Naomi Klein and Astra Taylor referred to the attempts by the super-rich to barricade themselves in their fortresses and let the rest of the world literally go to hell as end-times fascism, which will certainly fail to help, because people on the environmental left have been throwing around the F word for years to no avail, and that won't get any better because of a millennial vision of Völuspa, that's the Germanic end of the world, is added to it. End times fascism, who's that supposed to help? So what we're looking for, or what we need to look for, is find stories that will make people actually want to live. How many of you have read this book? That's even worse than I thought. Ecotopia, an anti-dystopian novel, I would claim what it is. It's a bit aged by now, but still one to dig up again. Section 3, Who is Who? Culture Wars. What has been called a culture war here, compared to the two previous sections, may appear mildly ridiculous until the new and old US president and his minions started their massive backlash campaign somewhat more than 100 days ago. Is anybody here besides myself old enough to remember the days when BLT was actually a sandwich? And I remembered this even wrongly as LBT. So when I first came across LBGT, I remember seriously thinking that another ingredient had been added to the sandwich. And I was wondering what G was. Then I learned that string of letters has by now been extended to, LGBTQQIP2SAA, or possibly even further. You're probably more well-versed in this than I am. Unfortunately, in their zeal to institutionalize and to codify diversity, equity, and inclusion, the mostly very young zealots that did this overshot the mark even for a straight ally like myself. That's what I am, straight ally. Don't get me wrong. I had a transgender teaching assistant at a time when most people didn't know this kind of phenomenon existed. Yeah. For a while, it so happened that in the department section that I was working on in Stuttgart, I was the only straight male. I was fully supportive of the one and sort of vaguely amused by the other. Everybody to the best of their abilities and as happy as we can make them. That's what I say. But as for the rest, I'd rather stay unconcernedly silent about it. I wonder when they will add left-handed people to this list. So being in the minority, I know what that's about. At the same time, the eagerness to differentiate into smaller and even smaller segments and the infighting over who has the right to call whom what has absorbed so much energy that I wonder whether we haven't actually brought some of the troubles on ourselves that way. And now we are facing a massive backlash by the reactionary forces that had been seething with rage, apparently, for a while already at the ways in which those who thought themselves progressive advanced these differentiations. As far as I can tell, the progressives weren't really progressives, and the reactionaries are definitely not conservative, which they like to think they are. It's not conservative to construct retroactive utopian situations out of a belief system that refuses to give up structural inequalities, and more often than not also racist ideas of superiority. And it's not conservative to deny diversity, it's reactionary. Reactionaries are the kind of people that try to insist on privileges that were already anachronistic by the time when they were still in force. Yeah. Looking into the opposite direction, progressive is not what many of these people did. Diversity literally actually means turning someone's back on somebody. And this is not where we want to be and where we want to go. Jump that one. To give you an example already from the 1970s, I did a lot of Native American studies, and there was this group that were called the we sorts. From we sort of people are different from you sort of people. By now they have been possibly over-identified as remnants of what used to be the Piscataway Algonquian nation. And connection rather tentative, but certainly this did not help anything like solidarity between the disadvantaged groups in the region, that they split up into even smaller groups and tried to stay aloof of each other. And unjustifiable as the incredible backlash against DEI in the new reactionary US is, it's only one aspect of those culture wars. Note, however, how holding up executive orders all the time chimes in with popular white Christian nationalist depictions of Moses with the Ten Commandments. This is the kind of imagery that we need to look out for. This is the kind of metaphorization of the situation that we can tell people about. The whole culture war was and continues to be, if you ask me, a fight over possession. In the literal sense, who owns the means of production? Who has the right to say what, call who what? A world where the so-called social media are owned and dirigible by no more than a handful of super rich people, infantile, middle-aged males cannot possibly be a just environment. There are deep structures here, something like the deep state that the reactionaries keep mumbling about, an ingrained structure of inequality and of entitlement. who is entitled to a larger piece of the cake, as if the cake was getting any bigger because it's being fought over. So how did we get there? The old days, which is where I would like to turn to our own profession completely and look into the mirror, which is not a very nice thing to do at my age anyway, but because I contend that historically we are at least partly responsible for the current situation. The function and role of literary studies, I claim, has been probably since its start that of intermission clowns of latter-day capitalist societies. Departments of literature, culture, also film and other entertainment formats were turned into university institutions in order to prove that latter-day capitalism has a culture, or maybe had a culture. By now they don't seem to think that they need us any longer. Which, of course, that culture, of course, is superior to other cultures because it was encoded in writing and in lasting and reproducible images and polyphonic musical scores, and because it could be produced on an industrial scale and in an uneasy cohabitation with that industrial aspect because it was topped by a series of literary and musical geniuses, or at least masters, usually males. In order to have a department of English, however, you need professors. And since there had not been a department of English before with such professors where those could be trained, they had to come from somewhere else. There's a certain logic to the fact that in order to establish academic credibility and a sort of factuality-based pedigree, the first professor of American literature was not a linguist, but a professor of history. Originally, that was Moses Coit Tyler in the US. Yeah. Now, there had been attempts at writing literary histories in the United States before. The 2-volume encyclopedia put out by the Duyking brothers. However, those volumes were arranged simply in alphabetical order and just summaries of content. Moses Coit Tyler added something new. His readings of authors like Poe, Hawthorne, and others tend towards the personal and impressionistic, yes, but all the other factors dominating the field are already there. The authors are predominantly white males, the language is English, and there is an idea of qualitative standards derived from classic Greek and Roman ancestry. With regard to this last point, English and American literary histories chime in with the general Western European tendency of aligning themselves with the cultural and increasingly also political ideal of the classics that in itself derived from the period when the Greeks fought off the advance of the Persian Empire. Given the Persian superiority in numbers, the eventual Greek victory must have appeared very unlikely to the contemporaries. There is an interesting argument saying that Greeks, and following them the Romans, therefore attributed their eventual victory to their cultural superiority. This ideology of cultural superiority has been following us around ever since then, with resurgences during the Renaissance and, of course, the classical period, including sculpture, painting, architecture, and, of course, literature. In the latter field, establishing public credibility was aided by literary texts offering themselves to be paired off and interacting with the ideology of a theological superiority. Thus, the field of English and American literature slid into a ready-made slot within the overall Western superiority complex. The situation is a bit different for us in the non-English speaking countries. So we were part of the same classic cultural inheritance. The English departments could not easily side up with classical philology. When my academic ancestor in Freiburg, Friedrich Brie, asked for extra funding to obtain books, he had to suffer the indignity of being called out by his colleagues from classical philology and philosophy, who declared for the records that there was no precedent for the fact that the Sprachmeister, The language master wanted money. Sprachmeister put him on a level with the dance master and the fencing master, who still existed at the time at Freiburg University. And this is the way it's in the actual record, indicating that whoever said that was actually speaking Alemannian dialect rather than standard Meister. And this is well, like with the fencing master. This is how English had started in Freiburg a century earlier with Karl von Rottig. Im Englischen gibt auf Verlangen Herr Professor von Rottig Unterricht. And you see above that as French and Italian, below that is dancing and fencing and also drawing. So this was the status of English at Freiburg University at the time. Besides, I'm not quite sure if he ever taught that, because this is 1808 and largely something probably in spite of the French forces of occupation. But then he was married to an English woman, and so this may have happened. The Grand Duchy of Baden had just been put together by Napoleon. Back then it was even easier for authoritarian rulers to construct and deconstruct states as they liked, and take over places like Greenland and so on. The thing to keep in mind here is actually this political issue. English departments in non-English speaking countries during the 19th century, the period of the World Wars, and also during the Cold War, were, however, loosely attached extensions of intelligence agencies. Besides professionalizing English language capacities of future teachers, their research as intellectual operatives meant the collection, analysis, and evaluation of data, which always also served the purpose of understanding the respective countries better, regardless of whether they were friends, allies, or the ideological and economical enemy. In some cases, literature professors like Brie, for instance, voiced strongly nationalist opinions during World War I. He was one of the signatories of an infamous pamphlet by German professors denouncing England and supporting the war effort, and he wrote several texts against das perfide Albion, and in support of the Irish struggle for independence. He also harbored an Irish radical who consequently did not even get interned as an enemy alien. So quite interesting. After the war, he had turned to the US and had Matthew Taylor Mellon, that's the cousin of, or nephew of Andrew Mellon, the finance minister under Hoover, as a lecturer in Freiburg. And Matthew Taylor Mellon in the 1940s was one of the richest people in the world. That's Brie. And with that, I turn briefly to you guys. The English department here in Iași, going back 100 years, seems to have started innocently enough. We heard that yesterday already with somebody who was a medievalist. Oh, by the way, you don't have that picture on your own webpage. Yeah, I found that. You can have it. But of course, book publications like these here, this is exactly the kind of stuff that I'm talking about. That would be interesting material to have, interesting knowledge to have and to share about these countries. More interesting still in the 1920s than the US, they were still rather isolationist. And we heard about Arthur Clare Cawley already yesterday from my esteemed colleague, Professor Papahaj, who escaped to Egypt in 1940 and later made it back to England, and the chair of medieval literature in Leeds. And then the Second World War was over, and the English teaching world divided into blocks. An Eastern bloc and a Western bloc, and in Western Europe, English departments were expanded and upsized in the 1950s and 60s. English department in Freiburg expanded from 1 chair to 6, and within 7 years. The reasoning was that Germany needed English teachers because everybody was expected to understand and speak the language of the British and North American victors. Beyond the teaching of English, new theories and methods of research were supposed to enable European scholars to join their British and North American colleagues in their aim to prove that even in the cultural field, the American way of life was superior to whatever the other system had to offer. The main method was still appreciating literature, or called appreciating literature. Plus, there was popular culture to relish that was produced on an industrial scale, bringing Superman and Coca-Cola to the furthest and remotest corners of the world. And English professors were supposed to supply the academic superstructure to all that, a complicity many of the accomplices never realized they were a part of. There were others. It must have been a shock to administrators and politicians to find out that, particularly during the late 1960s, some of the recently hired people not only adapted methods like Marxist reading to form new cultural theories like new historicism and cultural materialism, they also showed a certain interest in the other systems. Yeah? Strange people. As well as in systems outside and beyond the frame. Even stranger people. In most of these cases, the academic radicalism on display here was at best a type of salon communism. I remember one particularly ridiculous scene. This guy was going into retirement and he told us in all earnest that he had always been in the opposition. Dissenting fringe, possibly, yeah. But opposition and at the same time feeding on the kind of government handout that pays my bills too, that's just ridiculous, to be honest. I tend to think of myself as a fringe element myself, but they can't even bite the hand that feeds them. This is at best a sort of puppy that's trying to play here with you. That's bullshit. Little bark and no bite. But it was enough to start cutting back on English departments again. And what we see in the United States may happen to all of us within the next 10 years or so, that we're being cut back to just teaching English teachers, and beyond that, back to the Sprachmeister. As for the Eastern Bloc, by the way, does everybody recognize the guy on the right? Kropotkin. Pyotr Kropotkin. Anarcho-syndicalism. Everybody facing the Iron Curtain from the other side and the rift through Europe this symbolized probably noticed that World War II did not end really with a liberation, but in a renewal of the often coerced complicity between academia and political power. And we learned yesterday already that English here was abandoned for a while after World War II. For most of the East German universities, it was the same thing. And those that were in the field had to sign contracts with the intelligence agencies here. The amount of coercion and complicity was very obvious. Cultural production controlled, no freedom of expression, and so on and so on. I'm not telling you anything new here. But I must say, during my first visit to Iași already in 2006, and before that, I learned to admire the actual ability to find ways and to resist the situation that was far more obvious than anything like the protest in the West. I never met Hertha Perez, but she must have been some woman. But I met Irina Burlui because when I got my job in Freiburg, she was part of the parcel. She was already there, and I was supposed to pay for the one lecture that per semester that she gave there. And then I came across this book here in one of the bookstalls in Iași in 2006. And much to my surprise, there were stories in here by authors that nobody had heard of yet in the late 1970s in the West, and that had only started becoming popular. Canadians like John Metcalf and Mavis Gallant and so on. And so I learned a lot there. And then, of course, with the fall of the Iron Curtain, I became one of the profiteers of that, because some of the Eastern German universities that had not had American studies until that point got themselves new departments being formed everywhere. And so I was a para-academic mercenary, so substituting for those people that had gone east, and I got back into the business at the time. Unfortunately, the "we are the people," the cry of "we are the people" that toppled the East German government soon turned into the somewhat Wilhelminian sounding "we are one people." No equal qualities here, but I can't complain, or at least I shouldn't. It was a great time of opportunities for somebody with a recently finished PhD. Now, one might think, or one should have welcomed possibly, the idea that with the end of the Cold War, humanities departments could have jumped to the occasion. But what actually happened was, we heard part of that yesterday already, that the discourse of the posts took over. It had already gathered speed in the West, and now it also spread to the East, if gathering speed is the correct image here, because in effect it actually mired a lot of people in an endless cycle of bickering, while the forces of reaction were already rallying to lash back. At this point, I might as well admit how much I hate posts. Posts, to me, signal a constant look backwards, a fixation on what has not been quite finished and being repeated in an endless set of Möbius loops. Nothing post is ever quite over. Post-traumatic is still being staged. The post-factual still acknowledges the existence of facts, but has, since deconstruction, lost track of what they were. Post-heroic is an excuse for wimps and cowards not to rise up and do, or at least say, anything. Post-humanism obviously can't do without humans. Post-trauma does not mean it's actually over, but has you still wake up screaming at night years after the fact. I remember how disappointed I was as a student to realize that postmodern was little more than modernity plus Monty Python's Flying Circus. Now, somewhat like, and now for something completely different, as claimed by John Cleese in various contexts, but otherwise always the same dress, the same desk, the same tone of expression. But then the postmodern at least was accompanied by a smattering of the comical. Postcolonial was decidedly worse, insofar as it mainly meant that a bunch of unsavory imported kleptocrats was replaced by another bunch of unsavory autochthonous kleptocrats. Colonial conditions remain, more or less, and that is the problem with all the posts. They never manage to overcome and leave behind that of which they are the post. To make things worse, the postmodern claim that the grand récits, the master narratives, have been overcome, turned into a breach through which alternative facts got into scholarly discourses, and the exact reverse of whatever it was that could be claimed could start claiming the same veracity as what had so far been accepted as facts. Maybe not undeniable, but at least facts. So we get to post-truth here. And in my more cynical moments, this is one of them, I think that this compounded postmodern and post-structuralist quackery actually helped the current US government into the saddle. Also, grand récits have fragmented into all these diversities and became dozens of petit récits. Became most important to be different from everybody else, which not only resulted in the fragmentation that I thematized at the beginning, what was worse, that the creeping infiltration of this misunderstanding of diversity into all academic and administrative fields resulted in a treatment of issues of diversity and integration as if they were another theory of the decades before. So codification, bureaucratization, jargonization. I love this. As for theory, I actually think that much of it is another primary form of texts. So we have novels, drama, poetry, and theory. The advantage, seen as another form of non-fiction prose, theory loses a lot of its daunting appearance. It's not quite half the comical way out for the idea of equity. You will notice that so far I've been talking mostly about diversity and integration, but equity. Problem with that is that the earnest and well-meaning approach at equity became part of an increasingly monstrous kraken also that resulted in massive amounts of time and paper spent and printed out in a hopeless effort at keeping up with ever-increasing bureaucratic demands. Strangely enough, and just like the issue of class in that other trias of race, class, and gender, the topic hidden in the middle tends to get short-thrifted by even the more devout followers. Race and gender, diversity and integration are somehow more clearly demarcated things and sections. After all, they belong with those concepts that fostered identitarian delimitation, everybody in their own bubble. Equity and class, at the same time, are not easily graspable or even imaginable. Rather than the implied exotics, class smacks of the famous IWW scene in Eugene O'Neill's The Hairy Ape. Outdated, stuffy, somehow not as interesting as the others. Dull and boring. Now, try to find an image of this scene on the web somewhere. All of the other scenes are there, this one isn't. Class is something one doesn't talk about. Maybe a bit of precarity studies from the balcony perspective of a cultural sociologist, but please don't get any of that poverty on me. It's a bitter question, but I wonder to which extent has the insistence on race and gender diversity and integration at the expense of class and equity resulted in the desolidarization of literary and cultural studies. Anybody notice that there is not even a verb and an adjective for solidarity in English? No, this is where we're at. Yeah. So this is the current situation, more or less. Emergent capitalist societies already showing the same kind of format. I'll leave out this part, so I turn to the last chapter about torch bearing and other untimely occupations. I will try to sketch a vision of what we might or what we can do, not by denying that we are in a war situation or by attempting to stay somehow out of it, but by actually entering into the fray, embracing the chances that our profession carries in it. 1. Embrace an even more cynical view, especially of American culture and literature. Todd Gitlin knew already in the late 90s that popular culture was not positive because it was popular, nor is it resistant because scholars have found creative ways to define resistance, so it will include them and preferably without having to change anything. Speaking of change, how can we help the United States political culture get back on the rails? Demanding the Statue of Liberty back, I heard that from French colleagues, won't actually help. Notice something odd about this photograph? This is not the Statue of Liberty in New York. This is the 1/4 size model in Colmar in France. That's standing there. You're all merrily invited to come to Freiburg, and I'll take you on a trip of these places and we'll have a look at it. Looking at how other countries have handled similar situations, that would be places like Poland, to a degree Italy, Denmark definitely, and even the post-Brexit UK might help. 3, I said that. If English can be used, and if language can be used generally to camouflage meanings, it can also be used to uncover camouflage. Call it not climate change, but climate crisis. Call it not disinformation, but lies. One of the effects of disinformation on social media hystericals is the belief in conspiracy myth and legends. We can counteract that by pointing out the structural patterns behind such belief systems and by insisting on facts. For instance, the worst thing one can do to prepare for disasters is to watch American disaster movies. Why don't we use them to teach disaster preparation and disaster response? People tend to help each other in times of need, but you won't see that in those movies. When did villains become just badass? We can cooperate with other subjects and fields to discover hidden meanings and agendas in cultural product lines, and enable our students to develop adequate response capacities. And if the Vice President of the United States echoes that other presidential crook, Tricky Dick Nixon, with his famous statement that the universities are the enemy, it won't help to play possum. No? There has not been an as openly advanced aggression against institutions of higher learning since this one. The only thing that counts in the post-liberal world is loyalty to the supreme leader. And you may have noticed that I haven't pronounced any single one of the names. I don't show their faces. This is kind of they who need not be named, Harry Potter for illiberal democracies. They count on an atmosphere of chaos, fear, and uncertainty, and on the timidity of most scholars. But if all institutions of higher learning stand together internationally, we are a formidable force. Teaching English may be but a minor subject here, but medicine and science and law and economic research are essential, and they need us and our basis in rhetoric to communicate. Syndicalist cooperation contributes to security. That's already the 6th point. We won't ever be able to return to the securitas up there in the left-hand corner, provided by a rigid system of beliefs and a God-guaranteed order that puts everyone in their place, as in this 14th century fresco by Ambrogio Lorenzetti. This is the price we pay for ultimate uncertainties of operating on reason. We are dependent on our own judgment, and that at a time when no one can possibly still have the encompassing encyclopedic knowledge which the protagonists of the Enlightenment still try to collect. But while this is true today, more so than in the past, that we have to accept or refuse information without being able to know all the details ourselves, we can and we have to rely on what I would like to call common sense, which is not identical with the widely used formula, the kind of common sense that makes you avoid touching a burning log with your bare hands, but common sense as in commonly getting together, coming together, joined forces by people from all venues and backgrounds who dare to use their reason in a Kantian sense and for each other's benefit, who have not sold out to the dark side of the scammers and the bullshitters. It's the free association of not of conspiracy theorists, but of free thinkers, even though that may be difficult to differentiate sometimes. It's more in the direction that Thomas Paine uses common sense in, which is often misunderstood these days. He was thinking of getting these people together and forming a force that would then get into some sort of governmental role. This is a time when nobody yet knew what a democratic republic would actually look like, how that would work. There were very few examples of that in the world. And this, I claim, is what we can aim for in teaching, in discussing texts, in pointing out the various levels of meaning, not with the aim of valuing everybody's opinion equally. That was one of the big problems so far, because some of that stuff was really out of sync, but with the aim of striving for moderated agreements, which can work on a basis of mutual aid and trust in the goodwill of the participants to solve the problems we are facing as humanity. Climate wars, hybrid attacks, diversity that has made people turn their backs on each other. My understanding of the commons is therewith derived more, maybe more from the actual commons, where free people were allowed and invited to pasture their cows and their sheep and their thoughts and their ideas, where everybody can go to help out and to carry home maybe not the largest piece of the cake, but to help in the baking process and actually in their own bakery. As a cooperative format, this mode of teaching and teaching how to combat disinformation and how to prepare and respond to disasters can become, I would claim, a civil defense mechanism in our contemporary world. And with that, I'm simply going to end, and we'll have some minutes for questions. Thank you all for your attention.